Hello, hello. I'll give everyone a moment to connect to audio here. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rails 1306th New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Philip Larratt-Smith and Matilde Guidelli-Guidi. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Philip Larratt-Smith is a writer and curator based in New York, and since 2019, curator of the Easton Foundation, which administers the legacy of Louise Bourgeois. He has curated exhibitions of the work of Bourgeois, Twombly, Hiroshi Sugimoto, Yayoi Kusama, Bruce Nauman, Joan Mitchell, Andy Warhol, and others. He has also written extensively on postwar and contemporary artists. Larratt-Smith is currently preparing the selected psychoanalytic writings of Louise Bourgeois for publication. Our host today is Matilde Guidelli-Guidi, who's a curator and co-head of the curatorial department at Dia Art Foundation, where she organized exhibitions of work by Dwayne Linklater, Sengan Ngugi, Cameron Rowland, Kishio Suga, Meg Webster, and Jack Whitten, among others, and edited numerous publications. She's responsible for overseeing Dia's permanently cited works by Walter de Maria, Max Neuhaus, and Joseph Beuys. And as the organizer of the Artist on Artist lecture series, she commissions a growing roster of contemporary artists to respond to their peers in Dia's institutional history. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass the virtual mic over to Matilde.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. And thank you all. And thank you, Philip, for being in conversation today. Um, so, very excited to ask you more questions about this exhibition. Congratulations. I should start by saying that is currently on view at Hauser and Wirth. And for those who have not seen it, I think at the beginning, to me, something that was quite striking, it's almost like sound rather than sight that I remember. Like upon entering, we encountered this machine and kind of multimedia works, and we hear in the kind of dimly lit interior the sound of this machine pumping in and out of itself, and then behind the machine, we start hearing a sound which is almost like a woman screaming. Then all of a sudden we start discerning the words, but there's this surprise and kind of sonic space that I entered that was kind of extremely surprising and theatrical in a very specific and unexpected way. And then continuing downstairs, there's a second and third room that continues in this kind of, I want to say, tenor of um, darkness, some subconscious, visceral body, but also theatricality, which is something I want to ask you more later. And then instead going upstairs, as I said, an exhibition on two floors, and the upstairs instead is kind of much lighter, also in terms of palette, and the theme of floating seems to be kind of bringing together the works over a larger main room and then a second smaller room. Um, and across obviously a multiplicity, like one I can see through lines in kind of thematic through lines, but obviously the other striking thing is kind of the multimediality of the exhibition, and in terms of like how different themes are morphed into different materials and sculptural as well as like installation ideas. So I guess to begin the conversation, I'd like to ask you um, about your approach to bringing together these works and selecting the checklist and kind of orchestrating this incredible exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought was to do something that would showcase works that were less well known by Louise, or works that
Mhm.
had not been exhibited before, and other pieces like Twosome, which hasn't been seen in New York since 1991 in Rob Storr's show Dislocations.
Mhm.
I think the idea was that I think people often feel that they know Louise's work from the shows that have happened over the last, certainly since her death in the last 15 years, and there's kind of a I think, a kind of familiar canon of, of masterpieces by Louise that people are familiar with. And so I wanted to break with that grammar a little bit. And it's still very much, I mean, that's Louise's language, but in forms that people have not seen before. And I mean, the show is broken across two floors, as you said, because I really wanted to I want to highlight Louise's relationship to abstraction, which is something that she was engaged with from the very beginning, but which has always seemed to get less attention and to be less well understood. And so the device of breaking it between the two floors I had at my disposal was a way to, to show the continuity between more figurative or more dramatic or more theatrical works and works that are more restrained, works that are more abstract, that maybe more orderly, that consist of progressions. Because for Louise, it's not really a true opposition. It's something of a false dichotomy. Her mind is really working in both ways at once. And the same psychological impulse that leads her to make a work like Tusum or a work like Mamel's, The Fountain that we were just looking at in bronze,
Right.
lead her to make a stacked form or to make one of those cantilevered quad sculptures on the fifth floor. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And in terms of abstraction, perhaps actually, there's something very interesting about the second floor,
Mm.
being in the main room of the second floor as you exit the elevator at Outer and Weird, and you're faced with something that made me think almost like an inventory of
Mm.
everything that happened in sculpture in the 20th century. So somehow you have um, line sculpture, like line metal sculpture with kind of balancing
Mm.
different materials and weights, and then more kind of process oriented casting, which then she also painted over in this kind of very, contemporary way, and then the seriality of this and assemblage together in a way, using crates and then assembling them. This kind of assembled ready-mades that kind of remind the seriality of minimalism as well in terms of like the serial forms. Um, so yeah, thinking about, I mean, as you were saying, if I think of the work of Louise Bourgeois, the first thing is the question of narrative and kind of almost like symbolism
Mhm.
um, of her own biography. But yeah, I'd like to hear more thinking about your thoughts about abstraction for her, because definitely that's something that comes through in the exhibition in terms of your choices.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the works that had not been seen before date from the mid 1980s. Louise had
Mm.
come taken on a very large studio in, I want to say 1980 or 81, which is an old garment factory in Brooklyn, on Dean Street in Brooklyn. And that was her primary workplace until the mid 2000s when they had to give it up for eminent domain to make way for the Barclays Center. And so
Oh,
uh,
wow.
yeah, and so she had been working there for 25 years, and that precipitated the shift in scale in a lot of the works. That's when Louise started working on a much larger scale. She
Uh-huh.
wouldn't have made a lot of the cell pieces that she began in the 1990s if she hadn't been able to had such a large space to work in. And specifically with respect to the works on the fifth floor, a lot of them are made out of components of the garment factory itself that she repurposed as sculpture, that she took and, she either liked some formal quality that it had or the shape or the color, and she would experiment with it. And that's part of the reason why I wanted Gathering Wool to be the title of the show, because I think it's, the state of mind that Louise was in when she was working was often it was like she would compare it to a spell where she was sort of, you know,
Mm.
entering into a state that's not, I mean, not mediumistic, but something where she felt that she was letting her intuitions guide her and putting this together with that, seeing if it fit, if it didn't fit. Why did she want to stack something? Well, it was a way of imposing order on something. I mean, Louise often would speak about wanting to impose order on the chaos of her emotions, and so
Mm.
stacking a form or using repetition to consolidate a form gives her, it's like a pacifying gesture, and it gives her a sense of narrative control in a way, even though the form itself, like what the piece that we're looking at now, remains largely abstract. So this work, this appeared in an insert in Parquet in 1988, but it's never been seen before. It's never actually been exhibited, is what I mean to say. And
Wow.
these are, yeah, it's really amazing. These are wooden basins from the garment factory. And I don't know if we have a close-up image of the second one, but it contains two marble egg shapes that she put in. And so
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. Yeah.
it's a very simple gesture. And I think it's almost this idea of birth, of regeneration. And also it's a pair, it's a couple. And a lot of Louise's work is addressed to this theme of the couple. And the theme of the fear of abandonment, which is something Louise suffered from throughout her life. And so,
Mm. And
um,
many of these are also, I mean, at least as you go through them, they almost are portraits, some
mhm,
of these, or at least that's what they made me think, especially this kind of um, wire piece here that we have in the foreground of this installation view.
right.
And there's another one across it, which is even more imposing in terms of the details. And yes, it's quite spectacular. And yeah, behind those are the kind of the bronze sculptures that are painted over that I was referring to earlier in the kind of like more process oriented, and then the kind of more inventory serial ones that we see on the right. Um, I think you brought up something that I was on my mind very much going through the show in terms of one having works on view that I didn't know of, and at this point I've been lucky to see several Louise Bourgeois exhibitions, but there were so many works that were clearly by Louise Bourgeois, but that in an even like an idiom or a material that I didn't expect from her. And then,
Mhm.
but I was curious as going through the show and thinking about what was her relationship to. Um, you said there's something about like for her making art. If I paraphrase it correctly, you say something like putting order into the chaos of her thoughts.
Mhm.
And obviously, one of her almost like slogans is art is a guarantee for sanity, like this idea of kind of the art practice. But I could not help but thinking who was how what was her relationship to making work and to in order to show them. So there's you mentioned the warehouse and the large studio.
Mhm.
But yeah, I could not help but wondering, like, what was the relationship to kind of making works, for instance, some ambitious work such as Together downstairs. Um, was she making ever work specifically for an exhibition, or was this kind of like daily practice and kind of like how to give form to an idea?
I think it's more the latter, to give form to an idea or to an emotional
Uh-huh.
state. And I mean, Louise really worked. She made work to discharge her emotion, her psychological impulses, needs, blocked drives, her fears and anxieties. And she was very much living in the moment. I mean, I think there's often this caricature that Louise is the captive of her past, and on some level, the past never left Louise. It would, it had a powerful hold on her, the events of her early childhood, the sort of traumatic early family situation in France. But Louise lived very much in the present and responded to her feelings in the present. And so when she would often cannibalize previous works in order to make new work. She would sometimes take it
Mm,
apart or go back and modify it. There's a beautiful piece on the first floor, which is called Subliminal 2. Um,
hmm.
is made out of two slats of wood that Louise liked the color of, that she again took from the studio, and she repurposed it. She kind of she put them together like this. It's an act of joining.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. It looks like almost like a um, Frank Lloyd Wright or Miss Van der Rohe. Like it's very architectural in the way she joins it.
It is. It's the simplest device for her. It's really male female. She saw it as a sort of, and that's the subliminal aspect, is that the sexuality that was, Louise said was the fixed point of her identity is sort of coming through again, even in these abstract structures that she's making. But she made
Hmm.
that piece in 1986, right before she started making one of the really the prototype of a lot of the cells, articulated layer, which is a
Mm.
sculpture that's in the collection of MoMA. And in order to make it, she had two floors in the studio, and so she put a lot of the sculptures she'd been working on another floor. And basically, she forgot about it until she had to move out of the studio almost 20 years later. And then when she came back to it, um, she decided to modify it. So she took, I don't know if we can get an image of it up on the screen because it'd be good
Should
to,
be a little later in the slideshow
yeah,
if we continue.
yeah.
Um, the piece on the right, right? Is that the one you're?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the details that people will have to see this in the show itself, I'm afraid, but she took a almost like a lily of the valley, like
Mm,
a hat from one of her flowers, or flowers from one of her hats that she saved up over the course of her life, and she put it on the side, and then she stamped the 3 years of three significant deaths on the bottom: 1932, the year of the death of her mother;
uh-huh.
one, the death of her father; and 1973, the death of her husband, Robert Goldwater, the art historian. And
Yeah.
so she converted this piece into a memorial. And so this is an example of how Louise's work is about these returns, where she isn't ever totally finished with something. She may come back to it and modify it. And in the
Mm.
same way that she would use, she would use her own diary entries from the 1950s and 60s. She would take phrases and put them into works 20, 40 years later. And
Yeah.
she used clothes that she'd saved up over the course of her life. All the fabric sculpture, by and large, consists of Louise's own clothing, sometimes her mother's clothing. So I think there's a sense of you get a sense of how Louise worked from this, that she was, just as she would take pieces of the studio, she would also take pieces
Mm.
of her own life and kind of cannibalize it to make work. And so I think at a
Hmm.
certain point, everything was being fed into this process.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for bringing up the appendage or the flower attached to as kind of a last transformation of these two simple elements turned into what you described as a memorial. Yeah, I've been wondering about the dates or numbers inscribed. Um, but actually, the question of the appendages seems to be almost like a through line in the works
Mhm.
that you show downstairs, following together and the performance. We enter a room
Mhm.
in which, before getting to Gathering Wool, that we are seeing now here, there's, of course, facing us is Mamel, the fountain with kind of like, um, uh, as you were saying earlier, kind of like the family and kind of like five different points of from where water comes through, and then the previous on the wall, there's that fabric work with also those kind of like five flowers or appendages, breast-like or nipple-like, like protuberances or knots. And then in the second room, with Gathering Wool, we also see these kind of incredible mushrooms attached to the um, cottonwood, and similarly,
Mhm.
yeah, if you could, I guess I was really so, it was so amazing to see this idea of this kind of the appendage. And then perhaps we can look at the marble, which is hilarious in terms of like the appendage almost as kind of a parasite, or like almost like a something that will destroy its container. So the kind of the conjugation of this kind of very simple idea, like an attachment, is so phenomenal in over those two rooms in terms of like the way you show us a variety of ways in which this kind of very simple formal element, which is an appendage, is then um, conjugated across ideas of attachment, feeding, parasite, or memorial, as you were saying. So, yeah, just curious about your going through these works and your interpretation of her ability to kind of morph uh, through materials and how she would choose these different materials.
Well, I was thinking of the idea that, again, it's about this, the show is about this slippage between abstraction and figuration, or between these more psychologically charged works and works that are maybe more contemplative or more, again, more abstract. And so the idea of things coming out of other things suggested itself as a kind of motif downstairs to
Hmm.
kind of plant this idea in the viewer's mind that it's about this sort of breakdown and the divide between these two things, these two concepts, of these two ways of working. And so if we look at this marble piece here, perfect example, because you have this perfect sphere, it's a geometric shape, and then you have a child's arm coming out of the side, and around the base at the bottom, she's carved "I love you, I love you, I love you" over and over. And so it has this, the powerful psychological charge. It's like a mother's love for the child on one hand, but it's also an uncanny object. It's something that makes us, it's there's a humor to it, but it's also
Complete.
slightly awkward at the same time, and it's off center too. And
Yeah,
I wanted to have this together. Each room downstairs, I wanted the downstairs to have a narrative feeling. So there are three rooms, three chapters, you could say, and
for sure.
each one leads into the next, and it's a kind of dramaturgy. It's more dramatic than upstairs, more melodramatic. The
Hmm.
light is darker and moodier, and I felt that this was a way to deal with the architecture on the first floor, that it needed to be cut up and also to be able to show these large installations like Twosome, the Mamels in the second room, and then Gathering Wool in the third room. So those were kind of the three anchor pieces for each room, and then the other works were fit in to some extent around that, or grew out of what they made me think. So here, Gathering Wool was shown twice in the 90s and not since then. It's 1990. It's an important piece in part because it's a precursor to the cells that she would go on to create in the 90s and 2000s. It's an architect. She's moving towards making an enclosed architectural environment that then she would people with sculptural elements, found objects, personal items from her life that she'd saved up. This array of 7 cottonwood spheres in front of it was meant to be almost like a kind of arena. When she showed it, I think it was 1991 at Massimo Audiello Gallery, she would invite people to stand in the center and she would kind of interrogate them, ask them questions, try to confess. René Ricard, the
I was saying, yeah.
We have a clip of this wonderful moment where Louise and René are sort of in the center together, and he said that he wants to read his poetry, and she's they're sort of discussing it, back and forth banter. So it was meant to be more that it's almost like a performance piece, and that connects it, or rather like the backdrop to a performance, even though it stands as a sculptural installation in its own right. And that connects it to the video, which most people will not have seen, of Susan Cooper, as you said, singing, kind of screaming at the top of her lungs, a song that she and Louise co-wrote about her mother, the relationship to the mother. It's called She Abandoned Me. And so this sets this kind of strong psychological tone from the beginning, in dialogue with Twosome, which consists of a large container, and a smaller container is going in and out. A larger sort of tank is going in and out of a smaller tank, and on a track with a chain. And I think it's often been misunderstood. People see it as male-female, like a sex machine, because it's going in and out. But for Louise, it was really about the mother and child. So
which is incredible, yeah.
The child is coming out of the mother's body, but then returning to the mother's body. So this is really this kind of passage into life, and then, psychoanalytically speaking, the return to the mother's body often, is taken as an uncanny representation of the return to the womb is death on one level, because it's a loss of individuation, it's a loss of your identity. Merging with the mother, spells the end of your individual identity. And so this is, in a way, the trajectory of one's life, which Louise has presented here with this almost diagrammatic simplicity. The chain for her was the umbilical cord, and the red light in the back is danger. It's actually from a police car, and it's symbolizing this idea of danger, the danger of the separation from the mother, but the danger also of not separating from the mother. So it's this kind of ambivalence in the relationship, in the mother-child relationship. So the Cooper video is really meant to refocus our attention on this aspect of Twosome. And of course, it can be read in other ways, but I know that for Louise, it was really about this mother-child relationship, and I wanted to keep that kind of front and center. And I like what you said about this sonic element, because again, I think looking at this, Louise seems this could be the work of a contemporary artist, someone living today.
100%, yeah.
And it's the tank piece itself is very atypical for Louise. It could almost be something by Bruce Nauman. I think if you look at it, you wouldn't necessarily think of Louise Bourgeois right away. And it's been positioned in a kind of aggressive angle towards the door, so it really confronts you in a way as you come in. And that was also a way of kind of setting the tone for the downstairs.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, you said, and I actually wanted to ask about that, but now it's much clearer, the idea of like the juxtaposition of the performance and the reading of the abandonment, and then which is essentially flush with the wall and really kind of floor to ceiling projection. And it's both hidden and overcast, but then also present in the background as you enter the room.
And the volume is meant to be quite aggressive too, so it really
the volume is aggressive, and you kind of like hear this kind of scream, but you have to be in front of it and read the subtitles in order to discern what the words are, because somehow the together makes a noise as well. Of course, the machine noise of kind of the two bodies moving in and out. But I guess the interesting thing that you were articulating is the complexity of the relationship, which seems to be something that one could make a very literal word about abandonment. But what is always interesting to me, at least, and that returns also in the works by Louise that are on view at Beacon. There's some of the fillette, which of course is kind of like a female term, but of course is a phallic shape. And so this kind of continuous, confusion and bordering and creating borders, but then also breaking those borders through ambivalence. And obviously, I'm sure many people see this as kind of a copulating machine, not necessarily, but that is also part of the complexity of the relation, that renders the complexity of the relationship, mother and child, heightens the complexity, I guess. It's very interesting that she had the specificity and that you added the film to kind of bring us back to that, but at the same time, leaving open the polysemy of this gesture, which kind of doesn't close. Something you were saying earlier about Louise continuing to work through traumas.
Well, I think she is restaging this trauma of the separation from the mother. 1932, as I said, is the date when her mother died, and she had complications. She had contracted the Spanish flu and developed kind of chronic problems as a result of that. Throughout the 1920s, Louise's mother would have to go to the south of France in the winter to take the waters, to take a rest cure, and Louise would accompany her because the father was running the family business in Paris. So it was a kind of reversal of roles where Louise was really mothering her mother. And her mother died in 1932 when Louise was 20 years old. So I think it was kind of, just as, the relationship to the mother was really, the mother-child relationship really sets the pattern for all future relationships. So in a way, everything else is sort of subsumed under it or contained just in a sense within it. And this was the kind of primordial abandonment for Louise. So it kind of set the tone for later, kind of set the pattern for other abandonments later in her life. And it's also the fact that it's from 1991 is important because much of Louise's early work had been made as a negative reaction against her father. And by negative, I don't mean some sort of Louise had profound ambivalence towards her father. She idealized him. She was to some extent fixated on him. At the same time, she rebelled against his authority. She felt that it was a very complex relationship, but by the 1980s, she had really started to work through it, and I think she had processed it to a large extent. And she begins to pivot, I think, back towards the figure of the mother, which has this kind of almost like a narrative aptness to it. As what in light of what I was saying, Louise at this time is 70, 80 years old, and she's starting to return to the mother in a strange way. And Tusum, concretizes that in a monumental scale. But the return to fabric is also about the return to the mother. If we look at the flower drawing,
right,
second room. This is
which I think is the previous slide. Yeah.
So this is again, the 5 flowers are from hats that Louise kept. She's composed these 5 concentric sort of formations in the and put a flower at the heart of each one. So this represents the family to Louise. Louise was born into a family of 5, and she had her own family of 5 with her husband, Robert Goldwater, in New York.
Which is a number that returns also in the fountain, right? There's many breasts, but like 5. And that returns in other works as well, right? The number 5.
That's right. And so here the flowers are coming out of the drawing, like the water is coming out of the fountain, like the child's arm is coming out of the pink marble. Again, that's sort of the unifying device for the downstairs in general. But the use of fabric is related to the return to the mother. And this piece, this has never been shown before in New York. It was shown once before at Hauser and Wirth in Hong Kong. And the basin itself is not really part of the work. It can be shown outside. We created the basin in order to be able to show it indoors. But the work itself, this is a form Louise had previously made in pink rubber. She made a pink rubber edition of the house, and then she also made a pink marble version that's actually double-sided like a Jannis. So she has, it's facing both directions at once. And this was the 3rd material that she decided to render this form in. And Louise was, she was never interested in material per se. She wasn't into marble. It was something that she could use to render a form and see how it would change the way that she looked at the form, or the way that it would, different aspects of whatever it was that she was trying to express would come out through the use of that material.
And obviously, again, this also adds to the general sonic space of
Yeah.
the downstairs in
Yeah.
terms of this, again, mechanical pumping and um, adds to the, as you said, melodrama a little bit, but also almost like this pre-lapsarian
Mm.
sounds that you're immersed in as you go through. And then perhaps I do want to ask you to talk a little more about Gathering Wall and something that it's so striking in terms of its simplicity. Like it is so concise. I mean, you were talking about abstraction, but there's a concision,
Mm.
and it's almost like um, I want to say metaphysical in terms of like
Mhm.
the theatricality of it, but the suspension of it. But then at the same time, what you said earlier about her use of it. So somehow we see it inactive, but also from the videos that Hauser and Weird made available of
Mm.
René Ricard reading and she showing him the the mushrooms and kind of like that little video is a treasure really. But it made me think a little bit about something that you had been so involved, which is Louise and um, in this case, she's almost like as a playwright. You know, she creates the form as a stage for words to be expressed and recited.
Mhm.
But her writing practice, which is something that I still remember my very first Louise Bourgeois show, I was so, one of her early works, actually, you have one upstairs, which is the He Disappeared into Complete Silence, that kind of suite of prints, which is a little story. And I was a young person and I'd never seen, I think, an artist using narrative in a piece in that way. And it's it really struck me. And so the writing of Bourgeois has always been something, and how she includes writing in her work. But I was wondering if you could talk, you interspersed the show with writing. So from her diaries or psychoanalytical writing. So I'm just curious to know about your thoughts about bourgeois and writing.
Oh, she was. I mean, I think Louise was one of the great artist writers. I think that the written record that Louise left in the form of her diaries and psychoanalytic writings, the letters. It's a show at the Byler Foundation next year that will showcase Louise's letters with her husband when she was in
Right.
Italy working in the foundries and marble workshops of Pietrasanta and Carrara. She would be away for 6 months of the year, and she and her husband exchanged wonderful letters. And I think Louise had a great gift as a writer, even though she never thought of herself as a writer. And
Mm,
different registers, the diary is more day to day, keeping appointments, thoughts would occur to her, and so she would simply write it in the diary. The
hmm
psychoanalytic writings were a little bit more. That was really for the analysis that Louise entered in 1951, 52, where she was recording her dreams, making so-called process notes, responding to the analytic situation, and in a way, they're fascinating because this is a period when Louise, especially in the late 50s, has all but stopped making work. She's certainly not completing any works and putting them out in the world, and so. I think psychoanalysis at this point really takes the place of making art for Louise. And
mm,
it's related to this idea of, I mean, she was doing this because the death of her father in 1951 plunged her into a deep depression. She'd been very, depressed in the late 1940s and, was trying to juggle these different roles of being a good mother to her children. She had three sons, a good wife to
hmm
Robert Goldwater, but also having ambitions for herself as an artist. And I mean, struggling to achieve an identity as an artist in what was then a very, an art world that was very much slanted against women. And
hmm
so I think that those stresses would combine and recombine in various ways. The writing show are becoming more and more, I think, becoming more and more psychologically fragile over the course of the death.
mm,
And the death of her father kind of capsizes her, and she goes into a depression that she only really starts to emerge from in the early 1960s with a lot of the works that we have on display at Dia Beacon,
hmm
that are in a completely different register from what she'd been making before. And so, I mean, all of which is just to say that writing is central to Louise, to her identity, even though it really constitutes a parallel body of work. The writings don't. I mean, I put these 6 quotes up in the show because I think cast glancing views on what the show is trying to accomplish, not because they explain it in any way. And
Mm.
work isn't an illustration of anything that she's written by the same token. But
Yeah. Could you remind us, because I do remember there's one quote about floating
mhm.
upstairs, if I remember. You
Hanging
just
in the
said
pictures
there's a
on,
number.
yeah. She talks about
What's the other ones?
there is one on the wall next to Time, where she talks about the multiplicity of worlds. There's
Uh-huh.
one upstairs. I mean, they're a little bit more formal upstairs. Downstairs are more psychologically charged in keeping with the themes of that floor, more about the
Hmm.
separation from the mother and dragging herself from day to day. And I think that, again, Louise registered many different moods in her writing, but she never, I mean, the psychoanalytic writings were not originally intended for publication.
Hmm.
She gave me permission to publish them in 2010. I was working on a project for Buenos Aires and then for the Freud Museum in London. And Louise is, I mean, her relationship to psychoanalysis, like her relationship to her father, is fraught with ambivalence. And she would,
Mm.
I mean, she would sometimes say that art was her form of psychoanalysis. She would sometimes describe it as a joke. I mean, she, would sort of go, she could give different opinions at different times about the process, but I think there's no question that it was, crucially important for her in the 50s and 60s as a way of bridging this kind of breakdown, and I think gave her insight into what art making was for her, why she, what her impulses were, what her motivations were, and pointed the way to a whole new body of work that would sort of, continue. Louise worked really in. It's not a consistent. She never worked in a straight line. Like as I said, there are these sort of moments of return, and
Hmm.
I think, she often would say that the work is more like a spiral, and so it's sort of turning around
Mm.
itself. And many of the forms on the fifth floor consist of stacked forms like this. So this is maybe the stacked fabric pieces are maybe a little more familiar to the general public.
Yeah.
This is unusual because it's in a container. Like then there were five openings, so that's the talismanic significance of the number five for Louise. But
Mm.
it's not in a literal way. It's not that this, the one on the top represents her son Jean Louis. It's not. It's never simplistic like that. It's about these relations between things, and um, but I think that that's you know even if we think about I wanted to position these stacked works with other pieces that are more well known
Hmm.
in order to provide some context for them, because again I think a little like Tusum, if you see them in isolation, you wouldn't necessarily think of Louise, and you may not understand how it relates to what else she was doing. Some of them
That's true.
are quite quirky, and so having this show
Yeah.
the upstairs is less a narrative, more like walking into an all over experience. You mentioned an inventory. It almost feels like you're in somebody's studio and things are
Yeah,
set up, and so it is a sharp contrast with what goes on downstairs.
for sure. And then perhaps to go back to what you were saying earlier, and I had, of course, read about this idea of, theorizing or thinking about a practice as a spiral and this kind of idea of kind of returning to certain ideas, but also sometimes literally um, returning to a work and somehow not cannibalizing, but transforming it, digesting it, or metabolizing it more than cannibalizing. But I think it's very present in the very last room of the exhibition, which is also fantastic, even if it is the smallest setting in terms of like square footage. But there's four works. We see two of them here, and that is a phenomenal set of, talking about abstraction, is essentially grids, and all the possible ways of kind of remarking a sheet of paper with what she does is you know uh, both vertical or horizontal lines in predominantly in red, which is a color that we often, I mean, at least I often associate her to, and then blue comes in from time to time and it's interwoven. And then language is also interwoven in terms of, and space is made sometimes for the words to come up or short sentences. And then we realize that this is Tusanian share. Is that correct? The
That's the
piece.
cover of the piece. Yeah.
Yes. And so you see somehow exchanges in a couple and what goes on. And this
Mhm.
room shares, this work shares the room with, and so again, this idea of kind of a relationship through abstraction, because the grid is kind of like the basic of abstraction. And then across from it, that there's this incredible landscape without people, but it's almost like the land is a body with breasts, and then ladders or step ladders, and then next to it, again, we don't see it here, but there's a page from this early engraving. And so, yeah, this room was so like only this room is kind of a fantastic show. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this and kind of this idea of as you were talking about figuration and abstraction and
The
how she negotiated all this.
Sonny and Cher, I mean, these are double-sided drawings. There are 82 sheets, and she drew or sometimes wrote on both sides. And
Hmm.
it's really almost like a book, like a diary.
Hmm.
The entire body of work is like a diary, but this specifically consists mostly of these cross-hatchings. And she's making drawing vertical and horizontal lines. And
Hmm.
what makes the work so rich is there is this shift between different sheets, minimal difference. Sometimes the grid is this way, that way. It's her. I mean, they're not a perfect grid. It's her eccentric line making, and
Yeah.
it's again Louise taking something like a rational organic form and then sort of passing it through, like metabolizing it through through her artistic identity, and it becomes something completely different. It has this. I think it also has a relationship to tapestry and to fabric because
For sure.
if you pull a piece of gauze open, you can see through the threads. It's a bit like that, like she's getting in very close to something. And
Hmm.
in making these, I mean, she made a famous suite of drawings in the 1990s, 94, 95, called the Insomnia drawings, which incredible body of work that she would make in the middle of the night. And Louise suffered from terrible insomnia throughout her life. And so sometimes in the middle of the night, she would write or she would work, or she would draw. And I mean, these combine writing and drawing in a somewhat similar way. And the words become graphic elements in their own right. They seem almost, some of them are sort of embedded. And
Completely. Yeah.
flashes of humor. I mean, she says, "Nobody pays me no respect." This is
Yeah.
Rodney Dangerfield. Louise actually loved Rodney Dangerfield, thought he was fascinating. She loved watching him. So that's just sort of a little, detail that somehow creeps in. And she's making these in 2004, so 93 years old. And 92, 93. And she's, her memory is going to some extent. I mean, her long-term memory remained intact. Short-term was more. So she's almost trying,
Mm.
it's almost like an aid memoir. It's like, can I remember this name? And then the name occurs to her,
Mm.
the phrase occurs to her, and she writes it down so that she doesn't forget it. And so there is also this active, it's sort of an act of remembering on one hand.
Yeah.
And I think the pen is like a polygraph. I mean, she's recording these, that's like, it's so, the gesture is so simple that it's just kind of picking up on these little minute, as she would say, her petite sensations, as the
Yeah.
shifts in moods are being registered through the line making. And no, I think that, and I think making them was a way of working off her anxiety. It's a way of, this is again, she's imposing a kind of very simple graphic device,
Task.
to
Yeah.
a task to very exactly to
Yeah.
to manage her anxiety. So
Yeah. It's a phenomenal work in terms of like, again, yes, looking at the date and
mm,
her age and the sense of humor, but also, it's almost like coming full circle with
mhm,
Together Downstairs in terms of relationship and almost like symbiotic,
mhm.
um, and almost like
She
um,
said a great quote. She said, "The drawing is the most immediate psychologique, the psychological release." And so I think when she makes a drawing, it's different from making it. The sculpture is more, it can be more in the realm of the conscious, or to paraphrase Freud, I mean, she's taking something unconscious and making it conscious. And so she's trying to
mhm,
take something, some anxiety or a fear and kind of manifest it in physical form and thereby hopes to exercise it. Whereas when she's making a drawing, it's almost, again, it's a bit like gathering wool, where she's sort of I mean, like the phrase gathering wool, where she's just letting
yeah,
them wander and the pen is capturing
yeah.
the thoughts as she lets them flow. So,
And you can see, like, even at late age, there's something very beautiful sometimes about late work for somebody who's done work and used her hands on
mhm,
paper throughout her life. It's kind of like the way she can register, um, like the range of movement is limited and the range of kind of gesture is predefined, but the level of emotion that she can transmit is all in the facility that at this point she has accumulated and gained. But yeah, I was curious about your decision to include that earlier landscape as well, and the much earlier print.
Yeah, the plate, it's the eighth plate from He Disappeared into Complete Silence, which you said is it's a narrative and really 9 separate almost fables that Louise wrote, each one like a cautionary tale. She's talking about a very specific situation or narrative, and she's paired each one with an architectural form. In this case, and there are 4 ladders that are sort of almost look like they're hanging from the ceiling. For Louise, there's this idea of like claustrophobia and the desire to escape from a closed situation. And the floor is incredible in that etching. It has this cross hatching, which is why
yes, beautiful.
I wanted to put it together with the grid to show that from 1947 to 2004, again, this is this way of working that was interesting for Louise. It was a motif that she that returned to her, and yeah, again, I think that
and then in the landscape we see the ladders as well.
In the landscape, you see the ladders, and there are 5 ladders representing the 5 families. But there, I think the ladders are more like transcendence in a strange way. But it's also it is a portrait of isolation too, and there's something. Many of her landscapes that feel like the absence of humanity, of being alone.
Right, and so, but absence is always a presence. Like it's almost like a thought becomes a person in their absence, and vice versa.
And the breasts in that watercolor, of course, relate back to Mamel's on the first floor. So I wanted there to be linkages between the floors, obviously, to keep it from being too. I didn't want it to feel rigid or schematic, this break between the two. And so, again, to show how.
Yeah, that room does a lot. This did a lot for me going through the show in terms of like returning to the themes that are downstairs and coming full circle in a way. Yeah, I want to be mindful of time too, because I see that we have a lot of questions in the chat. Josh, I'm going to ask for your help. Are you reading the questions or?
Yes, folks can submit questions through the link in the chat, and then when we turn to the audience Q&A, I'll go ahead and facilitate that.
Okay, thank you. I guess to kind of switch gears a little bit, I'd like to ask you now with this show, what is your next project?
Oh, I'm going to Trondheim in Norway next week to start installing a show of Louise's late gouaches, a very different body of work that's at a new museum called Pomo. So it'll be this body of work Louise made in the last 4 years of her life, and a very intense red gouache that she worked with to make a photography of flowers, of childbirth, of pregnant women, families, couples, and these are placed in dialogue with sculptures, including the Mamels that I mentioned earlier, the pink marble that faces, like it's kind of a double Mamel's form that will be a part of it. And that show is called Echo of the Morning, which is it's a text from a suite Louise made called Hours of the Day. So it's about this idea of time and memory in this body of work. And the iconography is very much about the mother-child connection. I mean, mother is the central theme of this body of work, but I think shifting it in that direction hopefully allows a different reading of it. And
yeah, there's something quite interesting in terms of, you mentioned earlier that together the work downstairs could if it weren't in context, it could perhaps not be associated to Louise, but to a contemporary artist and a range of artists from, who came of age from the 60s onwards, but also artists who work today. And I can attest that one of the things I do at DIA is to run this artist on artist lecture series when we invite an artist to reflect upon the work of another artist in DIA's collection or past program to create it's kind of dialogues. And when I invite an art contemporary artist, I never um, prescribe which artist they should talk about.
Mm.
And over the past year and a half, three artists chose Louise, which is quite incredible in terms of um, it always tells us a lot in about what people are thinking about. So I'm curious and actually I should say one of the talks is at the end of the month at DHLC, and it's Kathy Burkhardt, who's doing quite a bit of work in the archives at the moment, and who knew personally Louise and participated in salons
Mm.
that Louise would host um, in her home. But yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts in terms of the um, currency and timeliness of Louis' work at the moment. And um, it's obviously, part and parcel of the fact that you're doing amazing shows for sure, but also curious in general about your thoughts about Louise's work today.
I think, I
And
mean, I would say that, I mean, Louise was, I don't want to say she was the late bloomer because she was making work from early on. She achieved recognition and with recognition opportunities in the art world relatively late in life. And so, and she worked in a very I mean, the body of work is very heterogeneous. I mean, Louise really started showing in the late 40s and early 50s, and this was the time of a signature style when, a Rothko is a Rothko, you can always recognize it. And so Louise was,
mm,
as I said, when she came out of analysis, she made a completely different body of work. A lot of the pieces, again, at Dia Beacon are from that period, and it was hard for people, I think, to relate what she was doing with what she'd been making before. And the president of the foundation, Jerry Gorovoy, who's worked with Louise for 30 years, said he would put on shows of Louise's work, and people would think it's a group show because there are just so many happening at the same time. And so I think it took a long time for the art world to catch up with what she was doing.
mm,
I think, that the idea of Freud's that the underlying mechanism remains the same, but the manifestation, the symptom keeps changing. And so Louise, it's almost the sculpture is a symptom of something, and it keeps moving around, and she can never quite pin it down. It's hard for other people to follow it, but the underlying mechanism and thematic consistency of Louise's work is remarkable. And I think that, so because Louise achieved recognition late, I think it took a while for the shows to really catch up with everything that she had been making. She died in 2010, and there have been now shows of the cells. There was a show, I think, an important show of the paintings at the Met almost 4 years ago about it.
mm,
Most people didn't know. Many people didn't had no idea that Louise had made paintings, let alone I think an entire decade's worth of work in the
mm,
1920s. And so I think it's still being processed in a way. Louise is still being, the significance of Louise's work, its meaning is still being adjudicated. And
mm.
but then I also think that, Louise is, I mean, we live in a very confessional moment. So on a simplistic level, I think when everyone's online disgorging spilling their guts all the time, Louise's desire to make a clean breast of it, to tell everything, I mean, to, it wasn't her intention to be a confessional artist, but she felt that she was confessing everything through her art anyway. I think it
Mm,
takes on a kind of, it has relevance for artists who are working in that way, working from their biography. And
100%.
and I think that heterogeneity was something that held her, maybe made it more difficult for her at the time, but now I think, is an inspiration to younger artists who don't feel constrained by genre or material, or, they don't feel the need to work to develop a signature style, so to speak. And
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully, I mean, the show, again, it's this idea, Louise's range of formal invention is remarkable. And my research has been mostly in the psychoanalytic writings, and that's what, the perspective that I bring to bear on Louise's
Hmm.
most of the time, but it's entirely possible to read it in formal terms and art historical terms. And in fact, some of the, I mean, the curator of the show at the Byler Foundation is Ulf Kuhn.
Hmm.
He will almost assuredly write a much more, straight ahead art historical
Art
appraisal.
historical. Yeah.
And so I think I mean, that's a testimony to the strength of the work that it can sustain repeated readings from so many different, scholarly persuasions.
Very much so. Yeah. Um, okay. I think we're close to the hour, Josh.
Righty, thank you so much, Philip and Matilde, for such a great conversation. We are going to go ahead and shift gears to our audience Q&A. If you submitted a question and would like to unmute to ask your question, we just ask that you have your video on. And so while folks are getting set up with that, I actually have a really quick question for you, Philip. Something that sort of came up throughout your conversation was the seriality or repetition as part of so many different works in the show. And sort of how that in combination with it's a lot of these works first time being shown, maybe in New York or maybe at all. And so I'm curious about whether or not that at the time that Louise was making these works, in addition to maybe the works that are more widely recognized or associated with Louise, was it that she was intent on those being the works that were shown in sort of institutional or gallery settings, or was it sort of the whims of the market at the time, or just general sort of collective interests?
I think again, when an artist works from her biography in the way that Louise's does, the works that have a stronger or more explicit narrative dimension, works that lend themselves more easily to a biographical reading, or even just to be read in terms of a story. Louise was a great storyteller, of course, are the ones that maybe capture the imagination of those who look at Louise's work most clearly. And I think, and I also think that in a strange way, it's, people often work from what they've seen. And so the show that you saw, it shapes the show that you will then go on to make as a curator. And so I think it kind of sets in motion this, it takes, I think it just, people would not be aware of these pieces because they haven't been shown, and then they don't get shown. And then therefore, to some extent they're quirky and they're off to the side. And then the shows that have been made since Louise's death in many ways have been sort of working through a lot of the maybe more celebrated bodies of work, like the Cells. The Haus der Kunst made a major show in 2015, or, again, the painting that. And so I think that it's just taking, it's not that Louise made so much work. She wasn't prolific like that, but there are so many different bodies of work. I think it's just taking a while to get, it took a while to get back to these, let's say. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that answer. Our first question from the audience comes from Andrea, and Andrea writes, "Hello, Philip. Could you please express your opinion on Louise's relationship with architecture? Despite the central themes of all her work, do you think she had conceptual references related to architecture, especially with the Cells when she used the houses where she lived during her life? Did she think about a particular space when she created some of her sculptures?"
Well, I think that's Louise loved architecture. The architectural, the relationship between the human body and architectural form really is very present in her early body of sculpture, the personages, and also the print portfolio that Matilde referenced. He disappeared into complete silence. So it becomes, can become a stand-in, a surrogate for a symbol of a human presence, and vice versa. And she uses it. Louise used her own house from Paris in some of her later work. She would make a replica of the house in Antony and Choisy-le-Roi, where she grew up in the suburbs of Paris. That appears in a kind of replica form, and it's a kind of condensed representation, almost a dreamlike presence of the early home shrunk down to like a tabletop sculpture. So it has this feeling of an uncanny recollection of her early life. But yeah, Louise was friendly with Le Corbusier in 1946-47. They spent some time when he was here in New York. She knew Frank Lloyd Wright and liked his work. I think it was an important reference for her. And architecture comes to the fore again more in maybe as a kind of structure that Louise would create really in the 1990s. And the idea there was to Louise couldn't always control the circumstances in which her work would be displayed. So to take these sculptural elements and personal items and orchestrate them into a complex presentation, and then to be at the mercy of an architecture that she couldn't shape, for her was problematic. She wanted to create these cells as a way of dealing with that problem, so that she could create a totally enclosed environment that she could control. And then within she could really, kind of choreograph the experience of these symbolic objects.
Thank you so much for that response, and thank you, Andrea, for that question. Our next question comes from Zoe in the audience, and Zoe asks, I was wondering if you might talk about how Louise explored themes of fetishization in her work, particularly the way that men fetishize women, or perhaps make women feel trapped, powerless, or reduced in some way.
I think, Louise made a famous series of paintings in the 1940s called Femme Maison, that were later taken up as this actually relates to the previous question as well, where a woman's body is topped with a house. The house has taken the place of her head. And, the head is the traditional seat of identity in Western art. So you could say that her identity has been taken over by by the domestic role that the house, could be said to represent. And Louise had a nuanced understanding of these things in the sense that I think she saw that the house provides security, but it's also a trap, much as a kind of, there's a piece in the show called Le Défi on the ground floor, and there's a female torso made of glass, and it's under a bell jar. Louise would often create these, she would use bell jars to contain some of her own sculpture, but I think she often used that as a way of expressing how she would feel, where she feels both, contained by something, protected, but the haven can also be a trap at the same time. And Louise was, I think, very in relation to what you said about fetishization. I think Louise said that much of her work was aimed at turning woman from an object to a subject. So the woman is the narrator. The woman is talking about her experiences from within. And again, I think if we want to look at one reason, I mean, she even wrote about this, that she felt that her early work was not. I mean, she had 3 shows and they were successful, 3 shows of her sculpture, 2 shows of painting before she went into psychoanalysis and took the break from art making that I mentioned before. But Louise felt neglected rather than discriminated against. She felt that people simply weren't looking at the work, and she laid, she felt that in many ways, because she was dealing with things like pregnancy or childbirth, these just weren't topics that people, that were interesting at the time, even though I think that's also part of the reason for Louise's currency nowadays, is that Louise had such a, kind of warts and all representation or expression of the experience of motherhood, and all its, with all its discontents. I think that is, this in a way comes full circle. So I'm not sure that, Louise again was, that she had children early on, and then she felt very much like she couldn't handle it. She felt responsible for them. But she felt that this was in conflict with her ambitions for herself as an artist. She also felt psychologically incapable of being in that. I mean, I think she had something like postpartum depression after having given birth to her children. It was complicated, but she was ambivalent about being described as a feminist artist. And this is maybe the last thing I'll say about this question. But she felt that she was a feminist in her life, absolutely 100%. But she felt that feminist art was really dealing with many sort of social and political issues, and her work was really coming almost from a pre-gender place. She felt a lot of the issues that she was dealing with are really more universal and are less specifically tied to one or the other genders. So she didn't like being described that way.
Mm.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that thoughtful response. That concludes our audience Q&A. And so as we close out here, I just want to say thank you so much again, Philip and Matilde, for such a great conversation and exploration of Louise's work in this new exhibition. Thank you, Christine from Hauser and Wirth, for their support in preparing for today's event. We'd also like to thank Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're available if you're available on Tuesday, join us at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Alex DeCorte and Ajay Kurian on the event of Mr. Dream at the Kunsten Museum of Modern Art. And as is Rail tradition, we now invite you to turn on your cameras and microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
much.
Matilde and Philip.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. It was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye,
Thank you from
everybody. Take
Toronto.
good care.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you from Toronto.
Thanks.